Have you ever noticed how the world never stops talking to you? From the moment you wake up, the notifications, the news, the endless chatter, the social media feeds, the urgent emails, all demanding your attention. Then there are the voices in your own mind, circling like restless birds, reminding you of what you should have said, what you need to do, what you fear might happen. It's a constant barrage, isn't it? In the midst of this noise, something precious has been lost. Something you may feel deep in your soul, a longing for a voice that speaks not in the chaos, but in the quiet. Have you ever wondered why, despite being more connected than ever, you feel so spiritually parched, so disconnected from the divine presence you once felt? Why the practices of faith that once filled you with meaning now feel hollow, routine, a checklist item in your busy day? What if I told you that the very silence you avoid might be where God is waiting most patiently for you? What if the empty spaces you rush to fill with noise are actually the sacred ground where the deepest spiritual transformation occurs? This is what Saint Ignatius of Loyola discovered in the quiet cave of Manresa, where God's voice finally broke through when all other voices fell silent. Think about the last time you truly experienced silence. Not just the absence of noise, but that profound stillness where you could hear your own heartbeat. For most of us living in the modern world, this experience has become increasingly rare, almost alien. We fill every moment with sound, with information, with distraction. Our phones are constantly within reach, our earbuds ready to pump music or podcasts directly into our consciousness at the slightest hint of silence. We've developed what might be called a silence phobia, an almost instinctive aversion to quiet. But why? What are we afraid might happen in that empty space? What voice might we hear if we allowed the silence to envelop us? Saint Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuit order, underwent a profound transformation through silence. As a young man, Ignatius was anything but silent. He was a courtier, a soldier, filled with dreams of worldly glory and romantic conquest. But when a cannonball shattered his leg during the Battle of Pamplona in 1521, he was forced into a period of silent recovery. During this time, with nothing but religious texts to read, Ignatius began to notice something peculiar happening within his soul. When he daydreamed about returning to his old life, he felt momentary excitement followed by emptiness. But when he contemplated serving God, following in the footsteps of the saints, he experienced a lasting peace, a sustaining joy. This discernment, this awareness of the different spirits moving within him, would never have been possible without the silence that allowed him to hear the subtle movements of his soul, and through them, the gentle voice of God. This experience led Ignatius to develop what would become one of the most powerful spiritual methods in Christian tradition, the spiritual exercises, which center on creating spaces of silence where we can become aware of God's presence and voice in our lives. One of the most revolutionary aspects of Ignatian spirituality is that it doesn't see God as distant or separate from our everyday existence. Instead, Ignatius taught that God can be found in all things, that the divine presence permeates every moment, every experience, every relationship in our lives. But this presence often speaks in whispers, not shouts. It communicates through what Ignatius called consolations and desolations, the subtle movements toward life and love, or away from them that we can detect within our hearts. The challenge is that these divine whispers are easily drowned out by the cacophony of our busy lives and distracted minds. Like trying to hear a gentle stream while standing next to a waterfall, we miss God's voice not because it isn't speaking, but because we aren't listening in the right way. Silence, in the Ignatian tradition, is not merely the absence of noise, but the presence of an attentive heart. It's a state of receptivity, where we finally stop talking at God and begin listening to God. It's where we cease our endless spiritual monologues and enter into genuine dialogue with the divine. The first dimension of silence that Ignatius invites us to explore is what we might call external silence, the simple practice of removing ourselves from unnecessary noise and stimulation. This doesn't necessarily mean retreating to a monastery or hermitage, though Ignatius did value extended retreats for deeper spiritual work. It can be as simple as turning off the TV, putting away our phones, or finding a quiet corner in our homes for daily prayer. Even Jesus, whom Ignatius sought to imitate in all things, regularly withdrew to quiet places to pray, sometimes rising before dawn to find solitude. But Ignatius knew that external silence is only the beginning. More challenging and more transformative is the cultivation of internal silence, the quieting of our own mental chatter, the stilling of the constant stream of thoughts, judgments, plans, and worries that fill our consciousness. This interior silence doesn't come naturally to most of us. Our minds are like untrained puppies, constantly darting from one thing to another, easily distracted, resistant to discipline. This is why Ignatius developed specific meditation techniques to help us develop this inner quietness. Practices like focusing on our breath, repeating a sacred word or phrase, or simply returning our attention again and again to God's loving presence whenever we notice our minds wandering. But there's an even deeper level of silence that Ignatius guides us toward, what spiritual writers have called the silence of the heart, or the silence of surrender. This is the silence that comes when we finally let go of our need to control, to understand everything, to have all the answers. It's the silence of trust, of placing ourselves completely in God's hands. This is the silence Jesus entered into in Gethsemane when he prayed, "Not my will, but yours be done." It's the silence Mary embraced when she said, "Let it be done to me according to your word." This profound silence doesn't come through technique or effort, but through grace, through the gradual transformation that happens when we consistently show up to the practice of silence and allow God to work in us. It's in this deepest silence that God's voice becomes not just something we hear occasionally, but the fundamental orientation of our being, the North Star by which we navigate all of life. As Ignatius himself experienced, when we enter this silence of surrender, we begin to see all things with new eyes, to recognize God's presence and action everywhere, in every person, event, and circumstance of our lives. In our modern context, we often misunderstand silence as emptiness, as void, as something to be filled. But for Ignatius, silence was fullness. It was where God's presence could be most powerfully experienced. When we enter into intentional silence, we're not entering into nothing. We're entering into everything, into the ground of being itself. This is why the experience can be so intimidating. In silence, we come face to face not just with God, but with ourselves, with all our unfulfilled longings, our buried fears, our unacknowledged wounds. No wonder we reach for our phones at the first hint of quiet. No wonder we turn on the TV as soon as we enter an empty house. We're not just avoiding boredom, we're avoiding encounter, both with our own depths and with the divine presence that waits for us there. But Ignatius would tell us that this encounter, though sometimes challenging, is the gateway to the deepest peace and joy available to us as human beings. The silence that seems so threatening actually holds the healing we most desperately need. There's a common misconception that silence is primarily for introverts, for those who are naturally contemplative or drawn to solitude. But Ignatius, who was by many accounts quite extroverted and socially engaged, discovered that silence is for everyone. In fact, it may be even more essential for those of us who live active, outward-focused lives. The busier we are, the more responsibilities we carry, the more people depend on us. The more we need these spaces of silence to reconnect with our truest selves and with the God who sustains us. Ignatius and his early companions, the first Jesuits, were remarkably active, founding schools, serving the poor, advising leaders, traveling as missionaries to distant lands. Yet they maintained this contemplative core, this practice of finding silence in the midst of activity. This is what makes Ignatian spirituality so relevant and applicable to our lives today. It's not about escaping the world, but about finding God in the world. It's not about retreating from our responsibilities, but about bringing a renewed, God-centered presence to them. The silence Ignatius teaches us to cultivate isn't separate from our active lives, but the wellspring that nourishes them, the foundation that supports them, the light that illuminates them. Ignatius would have us understand that the silence where God speaks isn't something we have to manufacture or achieve through Herculean spiritual effort. Rather, it's something we uncover, something we return to, something that's always already there beneath the noise and distraction of our lives. In the beautiful words of the 14th century mystic Meister Eckhart, whom Ignatius likely read, "God is at home. It is we who have gone out for a walk." This is a profoundly hopeful understanding of silence and prayer. It means that what we're seeking isn't far away or difficult to attain. It's right here, closer to us than our own breath. Our spiritual practice is simply about coming home to what is already true, already present, already given. The silence where God speaks is our native land, our true country. We are citizens of silence before we are citizens of noise. And no matter how long we've been away, no matter how foreign silence may feel to us now, there's a part of us that recognizes it immediately as the place we belong, as the condition in which our souls can finally breathe freely and fully. I'd like to pause for a moment here and ask you something important. Have you ever felt afraid of silence? That moment when the noise stops, and you're left alone with your thoughts, your feelings, your soul laid bare before God? I want you to know that you're not alone in this experience. Saint Ignatius himself had to learn the value of silence through his own spiritual journey. If this resonates with you, I invite you to share it in the comments. You can simply write, "I too have feared the silence." And if you feel comfortable, briefly tell us about your experience. Your comment could be exactly what someone else needs to read today to feel understood in their own faith journey. Sometimes, the simple act of naming our resistance to silence is the first step toward embracing the divine voice that waits for us there. Let's explore more deeply how Ignatius understood the relationship between silence and God's voice in our lives. For Ignatius, silence was not merely a technique or a practice, but a fundamental posture of the soul. He recognized that God's primary language is silence, and that all other languages are poor translations. This might seem counterintuitive in our Christian tradition, where we often emphasize the Word of God, the speaking God, who creates through utterance, who communicates through Scripture, who becomes incarnate in Christ. Yet even in this tradition, there is a profound recognition of God's silent presence. Consider the prophet Elijah, who did not find God in the earthquake, wind, or fire, but in the still, small voice, the sound of sheer silence that followed. Or remember how God led the Israelites through the desert with a pillar of cloud and fire, communicating not through words, but through silent presence. Even Jesus, the Word made flesh, regularly withdrew to silent places to commune with his Father. And on the cross, in his most profound moment of communion with human suffering, he entered into silence. What these biblical examples tell us is that God's silence is not absence, but a deeper mode of presence. It's not God turning away from us, but turning toward us in a way that transcends ordinary communication. In the Christian mystical tradition, this has often been described as the via negativa, the negative way, where God is known not by what can be said about God, but by entering into the cloud of unknowing, the luminous darkness where our concepts and language fail us, and we encounter the divine mystery directly. Ignatius integrates this mystical tradition with a practical spirituality accessible to all. He teaches that we can enter into this sacred silence, not just in monasteries or on retreats, but in the midst of our ordinary lives. This is the heart of his famous prayer practice, the daily exam, which invites us to pause in silent reflection at the end of each day to become aware of God's presence in the day's events. Through this simple practice, we begin to attune our hearts to the silent ways God is already speaking in our lives. There's a paradoxical quality to how God speaks in silence. On one hand, God's voice in silence is incredibly intimate, speaking directly to our deepest identity, calling us by name as God called Samuel in the night. There's a personalness to this silent communication that transcends what words can convey. Yet at the same time, God's silent presence has a profound universality. It's not limited by language or culture or conceptual frameworks. This is why people of different religions, and even no religion at all, can sometimes access the same silent depth in meditation or contemplation. As Ignatius would say, God is found in all things, and all people can potentially hear this silent voice if they learn to listen with the heart. This universality doesn't diminish the particularity of Christian revelation, but rather places it in a larger context, helping us understand how God's silence underlies all authentic spiritual experience. One of the most beautiful aspects of Ignatian spirituality is its insistence that God desires communication with us more than we desire it with God. This flips the common assumption that prayer is primarily about our seeking God. Instead, Ignatius would have us understand that God is always already seeking us, always already communicating with us, always already present to us. Our part is simply to become aware of this constant divine outreach, to tune our spiritual receivers to the frequency where God is broadcasting. This understanding transforms how we approach silence. It's not about straining to hear a reluctant God, but about removing the obstacles to hearing the God who is eagerly, persistently speaking to us. It's not about convincing God to notice us, but about noticing the God who has never taken divine eyes off us for a single moment. As the psalmist writes, "Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence?" God's voice in silence isn't something we have to earn or achieve or deserve. It's pure gift, always available, requiring only our receptivity, our willingness to listen. How do we actually hear God's voice in silence? Ignatius provides practical guidance through his rules for discernment. First, he teaches us to recognize that God typically speaks through peace, not agitation. The voice of God brings what Ignatius calls consolation, a sense of interior harmony, increased faith, hope, and love, even amidst challenges. The enemy of our human nature, on the other hand, typically brings desolation, a sense of restless anxiety, confusion, and diminishment. By paying attention to these interior movements in silence, we can begin to distinguish God's voice from other voices in our lives. Second, Ignatius teaches that God's voice in silence often comes as gentle invitation, not forceful demand. It respects our freedom, drawing us forward rather than driving us. Third, God's voice typically aligns with what Ignatius calls the magis, the greater good, that which leads to greater love and service, not self-absorption or isolation. And perhaps most importantly, God's voice in silence resonates with the deepest truth of who we are, affirming our fundamental identity as beloved children of God. A common misunderstanding about hearing God in silence is that it's primarily about receiving specific messages or instructions. While this can certainly happen, Ignatius would tell us that more often, God speaks to us in silence, simply by allowing us to experience divine love directly. This direct experience of being loved by God, of being held in existence by an infinite tenderness, is itself a form of communication more profound than words could ever convey. It's like the wordless communication between a mother and infant, or between lovers who can sit in comfortable silence, needing no speech because their communion transcends language. This is why Ignatius places such emphasis on what he calls the contemplation to attain divine love in the spiritual exercises, a prayer that helps us recognize all the ways God has given to us and dwells in us. When we experience this divine love directly in silence, it communicates everything we need to know. As Saint Augustine put it, love and do what you will. Once we've truly experienced God's love in silence, our actions naturally begin to align with God's purposes without the need for constant specific direction. Ignatius also helps us understand that God's voice in silence often speaks to us through our deepest desires. This might seem counterintuitive, especially if we've been taught to be suspicious of our desires as potentially selfish or sinful. But Ignatius makes a crucial distinction between surface desires, which can indeed be disordered and self-centered, and our deepest desires, which actually reflect God's desires for us. When we enter into silence and allow the layers of superficial wanting to settle, what often emerges is a profound desire for meaning, for connection, for service, for participation in something larger than ourselves. These deepest desires aren't opposed to God's will, but are actually God's will being expressed through our unique personhood. This is why Ignatius has retreatants in the spiritual exercises repeatedly ask for what they desire. It's not a narcissistic exercise, but a way of getting in touch with God's voice, speaking through our authentic longings. In silence, we can begin to distinguish between the fleeting wants that come and go and the abiding desires that reflect our truest calling. There's a particular story from Ignatius's life that illuminates how he learned to hear God in silence. After his conversion, Ignatius spent nearly a year in a cave near the town of Manresa, living in extreme austerity and spending hours in prayer. At first, this time was filled with spiritual consolations, powerful insights, and emotional religious experiences. But then he entered a period of profound desolation. He was tormented by scruples, obsessive thoughts about his sins, and feelings of despair. He even contemplated suicide. In the midst of this darkness, Ignatius began to realize something crucial about silence. True silence isn't just about external quiet, but about interior stillness. About letting go of our own mental chatter, our obsessive thinking, our self-judgment. As he gradually surrendered these internal voices, a deeper silence emerged. And in that silence, he experienced what he called an illumination by the river Cardona, a mystical understanding so profound that he said if all the help he had received from God and all he had learned in his life were placed on one side of a scale, and this single illumination on the other, the illumination would outweigh everything else. This experience taught Ignatius that God's voice in silence often comes not as words or even distinct thoughts, but as illumination, as a light that suddenly allows us to see everything differently. This illumination by the Cardinal became a touchstone for Ignatius, a reference point for understanding how God communicates in silence. He described it not primarily as receiving new information, but as being given a new way of seeing reality. He wrote in his autobiography, "The eyes of my understanding were opened. Though no vision was granted me, I understood many matters, spiritual as well as those concerning faith and secular learning, and with so strong an enlightenment that everything seemed new to me." This is a crucial insight for us. God's voice in silence often transforms not what we know, but how we know. Not the content of our understanding, but the quality of our perception. It's like someone who has lived their whole life in black and white suddenly experiencing color. The world hasn't changed, but their capacity to perceive it has been radically expanded. This is why the fruit of hearing God in silence isn't necessarily dramatic new revelations, but a gradual transformation of consciousness. A shift from seeing the world as a collection of separate objects and events to perceiving it as a unified field of divine presence and action. Other saints and spiritual figures have described similar experiences of hearing God in silence. Saint Teresa of Avila spoke of interior silence as the garden where she met her divine spouse. Saint John of the Cross wrote of the dark night of the soul, where all sensory consolations are stripped away, leading to a profound silent union with God. In our own time, Mother Teresa described how her work with the poorest of the poor was sustained by hours of silent prayer each morning. What all these spiritual masters share is the conviction that silence is not just a technique, but a relationship. A communion with the God who is always already present at the center of our being. They teach us that hearing God in silence isn't about straining to detect some external voice, but about sinking into the truth that we are never truly alone, that the divine presence is the very ground of our existence. As Saint Augustine famously put it, "God is more intimate to me than I am to myself." Silence is simply the condition that allows us to become aware of this ever-present intimacy. There's an important quality of God's voice in silence that Ignatius helps us understand. It speaks not just to our minds, but to our whole being. In our rational text-based culture, we often reduce communication to the transmission of ideas or concepts. But divine communication in silence engages all dimensions of our humanity, our emotions, our bodies, our intuition, our imagination. This is why Ignatius developed prayer methods that involve all these facets of our being, like his famous composition of place, where we use our imagination to place ourselves within a gospel scene, or his application of the senses, where we engage with Scripture through seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching. These approaches recognize that God's voice reaches us not just through conceptual understanding, but through embodied experience. Think about the times you felt God's presence most powerfully. It was likely not just a thought, but a full-bodied knowing, a sense of rightness or peace or love that permeated your entire being. This is the kind of communication that silence makes possible, a knowing that's deeper and more comprehensive than what words alone can convey. What are the practical obstacles that prevent us from hearing God in silence? The first and most obvious is our cultural addiction to noise and stimulation. We live in a society that equates silence with emptiness and boredom, that treats every unfilled moment as an opportunity for productivity or entertainment. Our devices offer instant escape from silence, constant connection to the external world, but at the cost of disconnection from our interior lives. There's also our natural resistance to silence because of what we might find there. Like the person who keeps the TV on to avoid feeling lonely, we fill our lives with noise to avoid confronting unresolved emotions, uncomfortable truths, or existential questions. And then there are the more subtle interior obstacles that Ignatius identified, what he called disordered attachments, the ways we cling to things, people, outcomes, or self-image in a way that blocks our freedom and receptivity to God's voice. These attachments create a constant interior noise, a stream of desires, fears, and calculations that drowns out the more subtle movements of the spirit. Ignatius also recognized a more spiritual obstacle to hearing God in silence, what he called the enemy of human nature, the forces within and around us that resist our movement toward God. This enemy operates through deception, often disguising itself as light, presenting thoughts or feelings that seem spiritual but actually lead us away from authentic communion with God. One of the most common tactics is to make silence itself seem threatening, boring, or pointless. You might sit down to pray in silence and immediately be flooded with thoughts like, "This is a waste of time. You're not doing this right. You should be doing something more productive," or "You're just talking to yourself." Ignatius would identify these as the voice of the enemy, attempting to disrupt your connection with God. Another tactic is to use our own perfectionism against us, to convince us that unless we achieve some ideal state of interior silence, our prayer is worthless. Ignatius counters this by emphasizing that what matters is not the quality of our silence, but our faithful showing up, our willingness to keep returning to silence even when it feels dry or difficult. God honors this faithfulness far more than any achievement of perfect meditation. The good news is that Ignatius offers practical methods for overcoming these obstacles. His spiritual exercises begin with what he calls the principle and foundation, a meditation on our created purpose that helps us loosen our grip on disordered attachments and open ourselves to God's will. He teaches the practice of Ignatian contemplation, where we use our imagination to enter into gospel scenes and listen to Jesus speaking to us personally. He provides the daily exam, a simple 5-step reflection that helps us detect God's presence in our daily lives. And perhaps most importantly, he teaches us to practice agere contra, to act against our disordered tendencies, to deliberately choose the opposite of what keeps us from silence. If we're addicted to our phones, we might practice leaving them in another room during prayer. If we're afraid of being alone, we might schedule short periods of solitude. If we're always rushing, we might deliberately slow down, taking time to notice the world around us. These simple practices gradually break down our resistance to silence and create space for God's voice to be heard. It's important to understand that Ignatius doesn't see silence as an end in itself, but as a means to greater love and service. For him, the purpose of hearing God's voice in silence is to become more effective instruments of divine love in the world. This is captured in the Ignatian ideal of being contemplatives in action, people who maintain an interior silence and attentiveness to God even in the midst of active engagement with the world. Ignatius believed that the most profound experiences of God often come not in dramatic revelations, but in the ordinary moments of life approached with an attentive heart. This is what he meant by finding God in all things. The silence he teaches is not just something we practice in designated prayer times, but an interior quality we can cultivate throughout our day. It's a way of moving through the world with one ear always attuned to the divine whisper that accompanies us everywhere. This is why Jesuit spirituality has produced both mystics and activists, contemplatives and scientists, people equally at home in silent prayer and world-changing action. This Ignatian approach to integrating silence and action offers a powerful alternative to the frenetic, fragmented way many of us live our lives today. Instead of constantly switching between disconnected activities, always in reaction mode, perpetually distracted and divided against ourselves, we can learn to live from a unified center, a silent core of communion with God that informs and integrates all our activities. This doesn't mean we never get busy or stressed or overwhelmed. Even Ignatius had days filled with endless meetings, correspondence, and administrative responsibilities as he led the rapidly growing Society of Jesus. The difference is that when we cultivate this silent center, the busyness doesn't define us or consume us. We maintain an interior freedom, an ability to step back, to discern, to respond rather than just react. We don't lose ourselves in the whirlwind of activity because we're anchored in something deeper, in the silence where God speaks our true name and reminds us of our true purpose. How might you begin to incorporate this Ignatian approach to silence in your own life? First, start small. Even 5 minutes of intentional silence each day can begin to shift your relationship with quiet. Find a time and place where you won't be interrupted. Put your phone on airplane mode or in another room, and simply sit in God's presence. Don't worry about having profound experiences or hearing clear messages. Just show up consistently, offering your presence to the divine presence. Second, practice what Ignatius calls preparatory prayer, a simple asking that all your intentions, actions, and operations be directed purely to the service and praise of God. This helps orient your silence toward relationship rather than achievement. Third, be patient with yourself when your mind wanders or when you encounter interior resistance. These are normal parts of the journey into silence. Rather than fighting against distractions, gently bring your attention back to God's presence. Perhaps using a simple phrase like, "Here I am, Lord," or just focusing on your breath as an anchor. Fourth, consider ending each day with a simplified exam, reviewing the day in God's presence and noticing when you felt close to God and when you felt distant. This practice gradually trains your spiritual senses to recognize God's silent presence in your daily life. Let me walk you through a simple version of the daily exam that can help you begin to hear God's voice in the silence of your own experience. First, take a moment to settle into silence, becoming aware of God's loving presence with you right now. Second, look back over your day with gratitude, noticing the gifts you've received, both small and large. This grateful awareness helps open your heart to God's communication. Third, pay attention to the feelings that stirred in you throughout the day. The consolations and desolations, the moments of life and energy, or the moments of heaviness and resistance. Ignatius teaches that God often speaks to us through these feelings. Fourth, choose one feature of the day and pray from it, allowing your reflection to become conversation with God. Maybe there was a moment of joy you want to thank God for, or a difficult interaction you need help understanding. Finally, look forward to tomorrow, asking for God's light and grace for what's to come. This simple practice, done consistently, helps us develop ears to hear God's voice speaking through the ordinary events and feelings of our lives. It trains us to recognize the divine communication that's constantly occurring beneath the surface of our experience. For those who want to go deeper, you might explore some of the specific prayer methods Ignatius offers in the spiritual exercises. One particularly powerful approach is what he calls the application of the senses, where you imaginatively enter into a gospel scene and experience it through each of your senses, what you would see, hear, smell, taste, and touch if you were physically present. This immersive contemplation creates a space where you can encounter Jesus directly and hear his voice speaking to your particular situation. Another helpful practice is Ignatius's contemplation to attain divine love, where you reflect on all the ways God has given to you and dwells in you, moving toward a profound awareness of God's presence in everything around you and within you. These more structured approaches to prayer can help deepen your capacity to hear God in silence, especially if you find completely unstructured silence challenging at first. As you develop your practice of silence, you may begin to notice subtle shifts in your spiritual life. Perhaps you'll find yourself becoming more aware of God's presence throughout your day, catching glimpses of divine beauty in ordinary moments. You might discover a greater sensitivity to the movements of consolation and desolation in your heart, making it easier to discern God's will in specific situations. You may experience a growing inner freedom, a loosening of the grip that certain attachments, fears, or compulsions have had on you. Your prayer might become less about talking to God and more about being with God, less about requests and more about relationship. And perhaps most significantly, you might find that the silence begins to transform you from the inside out, making you more patient, more compassionate, more present to others, more aligned with God's purposes in the world. These fruits of silence aren't just private spiritual benefits, but gifts that overflow into your relationships and communities. It's also important to acknowledge that the journey into silence isn't always smooth or linear. You may experience what spiritual writers have called the dark night of the soul, periods where God seems absent, where prayer feels dry, where silence seems empty rather than full. Ignatius himself went through this experience at Manresa and throughout his life. These desert times aren't signs of failure, but invitations to a deeper faith, a more mature relationship with God that isn't dependent on feelings or experiences. During such times, Ignatius counsels us not to make major changes, but to maintain our spiritual practices, trusting that beneath the apparent absence, God is doing important work in our souls. Often, these periods of spiritual dryness are precisely when God is speaking most deeply, inviting us beyond a self-centered spirituality to a more selfless love. The silence that feels like abandonment may actually be God drawing so close that our ordinary ways of perceiving cannot register the intimacy. Another challenge you might encounter is the voice of your inner critic. the judgmental thoughts that can arise in silence. You might hear messages like, "You're doing this wrong," "You're wasting your time," or "This isn't working." Ignatius would identify these as the voice of the enemy of human nature, the spiritual forces that seek to discourage us from drawing closer to God. His counsel is to recognize these thoughts for what they are, not to engage with them, and to gently return to an awareness of God's loving presence. It can help to remember that God's voice in silence typically brings peace, not agitation, encouragement rather than condemnation, freedom rather than constriction. If the voice you're hearing in silence makes you feel smaller, more fearful, more isolated, it's probably not God's voice. The divine voice, even when challenging us, always affirms our fundamental belovedness and calls us toward greater life and love. You might also find yourself facing practical challenges in creating space for silence in your life. Maybe you have small children who need constant attention, or a demanding job with long hours, or responsibilities caring for others that leave you little time for yourself. Ignatius, who led an extraordinarily active life as the head of a rapidly growing religious order, would understand these challenges. His response would be twofold. First, he would encourage you to find creative ways to incorporate short moments of silence into your existing routine. The pray-as-you-go approach that finds God in the midst of activity, rather than apart from it. Second, he would challenge you to examine whether all the busyness in your life is truly necessary, or whether there are things you could let go of to create more space for what truly matters. This isn't about inducing guilt, but about honest discernment. As he writes in the Spiritual Exercises, we should use created things to the extent that they help us toward our end, and we should withdraw from them to the extent that they hinder us from it. The question becomes not, do I have time for silence? But what adjustments can I make in my life to prioritize this essential spiritual practice? There's a beautiful teaching in Ignatian spirituality about finding God not just in designated prayer times, but in all things, all experiences, all moments of our lives. This doesn't diminish the importance of explicit silence and prayer, but rather extends its reach, helping us develop what might be called a contemplative awareness that we carry with us throughout our day. Ignatius suggests practical ways to cultivate this awareness, like briefly pausing before any significant activity to remember God's presence, or saying a short prayer on the hour as a way of punctuating our day with moments of sacred attention. He also teaches what he calls the particular exam, where we focus on developing a specific virtue or addressing a specific fault, checking in with ourselves throughout the day to notice how we're doing. These practices help us extend the benefits of silence into our active lives, creating a more integrated spirituality where contemplation and action are not separate compartments, but different dimensions of a unified life in God. In our modern world, the practice of silence can seem countercultural, even revolutionary. We live in a society that values productivity over presence, that equates worth with output, that conditions us to see silence as wasted time. Choosing silence is an act of resistance against these cultural currents, a declaration that being is as important as doing, that listening is as valuable as speaking, that our worth isn't determined by what we produce but by who we are as beloved children of God. This is why the practice of silence isn't just personally transformative, but potentially world-changing. Imagine a society where more people were attuned to God's voice in silence, where decisions were made from a place of deep listening rather than reactivity, where the constant noise of polarization was replaced by a contemplative awareness of our shared humanity. This is part of what Ignatius envisioned through the Spiritual Exercises. Not just individual transformation, but social and institutional renewal rooted in attentiveness to God's presence and action in the world. We can see the social implications of this Ignatian approach to silence in the remarkable contributions of Jesuits throughout history. They have been at the forefront of education, science, social justice, dialogue between cultures, and care for the marginalized. This activism doesn't come despite their contemplative practice, but because of it. Their silence isn't a retreat from the world, but a deeper way of engaging with it, informed by attentiveness to God's voice and God's desires for creation. This is perhaps one of the most countercultural aspects of Ignatian spirituality in our divided times. It offers a model of engagement that's neither the angry activism that fights for justice without spiritual grounding, nor the privatized spirituality that seeks personal peace without social commitment. Instead, it demonstrates how silence can make us both more deeply centered and more effectively engaged, both more at peace within ourselves and more disturbed by the suffering of others. both more accepting of what cannot be changed and more dedicated to changing what should not be accepted. This integration of contemplation and action, of silence and speech, of being and doing, is exactly what our fractured world most desperately needs. Some practical advice for incorporating silence into your busy life. First, identify the margins in your day, the in-between times that could become spaces of silent awareness, the morning shower, the commute to work, the wait in the checkout line. These moments, approached with intention, can become tiny sanctuaries of silence. Second, consider creating a simple prayer corner in your home, a visual reminder of your commitment to silence. It doesn't need to be elaborate, perhaps just a candle, a Bible, and a comfortable place to sit. This physical space can help cue your mind and heart for silence. Third, explore whether there are contemplative communities or spiritual directors in your area who could support your journey into silence. While silence is deeply personal, it doesn't have to be solitary. The encouragement and wisdom of others who value silence can sustain us when we struggle. Fourth, remember that Ignatian silence isn't about perfection, but about practice. You don't need to achieve some ideal state of interior quiet to benefit from silence. Each return to silence, however brief or imperfect, is a step toward greater intimacy with God. You might also consider incorporating what Ignatius calls liturgical points into your day, specific times when you pause for a moment of silence and awareness. Traditional religious communities have done this through the liturgy of the hours, praying at set times throughout the day. While this full practice might not be feasible in a busy secular life, you could adapt it by setting gentle alarms on your phone for morning, noon, and evening, times when you take 30 seconds to breathe, remember God's presence, and realign your heart. Another practical suggestion is to create technology-free zones or times in your life, spaces where silence has a chance to emerge naturally. This might be a room in your home where devices aren't allowed, or certain hours of the day, like the first hour after waking or the last hour before sleep, when you abstain from screens. You could also explore incorporating silence into family or community life. Perhaps having a regular meal where conversation gives way to appreciative silence, or beginning meetings with a moment of centering quiet. These simple practices help weave silence into the fabric of our days, rather than treating it as a separate compartment of life. What might silence reveal to you if you created more space for it in your life? Perhaps you'd discover dimensions of God's character that have been hidden from you, aspects of divine love or wisdom or creativity that can only be perceived in quiet. Perhaps you'd encounter parts of yourself that have been neglected or suppressed, gifts or callings or wounds that need attention. Perhaps you'd gain clarity about decisions or relationships that have felt confusing or overwhelming. Perhaps you'd simply experience a deeper peace, a settled sense of being held in existence by a love that precedes and surrounds all your striving. The specific revelations that come in silence are unique to each person, but Ignatius would assure us that something awaits us there, that God is eager to communicate with us in ways that transcend words if we will only create the conditions for listening. The silence he invites us into is alive with possibility, pregnant with meaning, resonant with the voice that spoke the universe into being, and still speaks our names with infinite tenderness. I want to share a personal reflection that might help illustrate the transformative power of silence in a practical way. Several years ago, I went through a period of intense anxiety and inner turmoil. My mind was constantly racing with worries about the future, regrets about the past, judgments about myself and others. I tried various approaches to find peace, from self-help books to therapy to medication, all of which were helpful, but didn't quite reach the core of my distress. Then I encountered Ignatian spirituality and began to practice intentional silence each day, just 15 minutes at first. It wasn't easy. My thoughts would race, my body would fidget, and I'd find endless excuses to cut the time short. But gradually, something began to shift. I started to notice a subtle distinction between my thoughts and my awareness of those thoughts. I realized I wasn't my anxiety, but the consciousness that could observe it with compassion. And in that space between my thoughts and my awareness, I began to sense another presence, a loving attention that held both me and my struggles in a larger embrace. This wasn't a dramatic revelation, but a quiet unfolding, a gradual recognition that I wasn't alone in my interior space, that the silence wasn't empty, but full of a presence that knew me better than I knew myself, and loved me more completely than I could imagine. This experience didn't magically eliminate my anxiety or solve all my problems, but it fundamentally changed my relationship to them. They no longer defined me or controlled me in the same way. I had found a silent center, a place of communion with God that gave me a different perspective on my challenges. And from that center, I could engage with my life more wisely, more compassionately, more effectively. This is what Ignatius means by finding God in all things. It's not that my circumstances changed dramatically, but my capacity to recognize divine presence and action within those circumstances was transformed. This is the gift that silence offers us, not an escape from our lives, but a deeper way of living them. Not an absence of difficulty, but a new relationship to it. Not a withdrawal from the world, but a more grounded engagement with it. The silence where God speaks doesn't remove us from reality, but helps us perceive and participate in it more fully, more truthfully, more lovingly. If these reflections on Saint Ignatius's teachings about silence have touched something in your heart, I invite you to subscribe to this channel where we explore together the path toward a deeper and more authentic faith. Each week, we share teachings inspired by the lives of the saints to transform our spiritual life and draw closer to God. You are not alone in this search. Many of us are trying to live our faith with greater fidelity in today's world. Thank you for sharing this moment of reflection. Your presence here is already a sign of grace at work in your life. As we draw to a close, I want to leave you with a powerful image from Ignatius's own experience. During his time of profound spiritual transformation at Manresa, he would often sit by the river Cardona, gazing into its flowing waters. One day, as he sat in silence, he experienced what he later described as an illumination, a moment of insight so profound that he said if all the wisdom he had gained in the rest of his life were placed on one side of a scale, and this single moment of understanding on the other, the illumination by the Cardinal would outweigh everything else. What was revealed to Ignatius in that silent moment wasn't primarily new information, but a new vision, a way of seeing reality as saturated with divine presence. He wrote, "God dealt with me in this matter as a schoolmaster deals with a child whom he is teaching. This is perhaps the deepest truth about how God speaks to us in silence. It's not primarily about messages or instructions, though these may come. It's about education in the root sense of that word, a drawing out, a development of our capacity to see what has always been there, to hear what has always been speaking. Imagine a child learning to recognize birds by their songs. At first, the forest is just a cacophony of indistinguishable sounds. But gradually, with practice and the guidance of a patient teacher, the child learns to distinguish the robin's cheerful warble from the mourning dove's coo, the chickadee's call from the cardinal's whistle. Nothing about the birds has changed, but everything about the child's perception has transformed. This is what happens to us as we practice silence in the Ignatian way. We don't make God start speaking. We develop ears to hear what God has always been saying. We don't create divine presence. We awaken to the presence that has always been sustaining us, moment by moment, breath by breath. This awakening is both a gift and a task, both grace and practice. The silence that makes it possible is available to us in every moment, waiting like a doorway to a more abundant life, to a more intimate communion with the one who has been speaking our name from the foundation of the world. Will you enter that silence today? Will you listen for the voice that speaks not in the earthquake or fire, but in the sound of sheer silence, the voice that knows you better than you know yourself, and loves you more than you dare to imagine? In that silence, you may discover not just a new spiritual practice, but a new way of being in the world, a life marked by greater freedom, deeper peace, and more authentic love. This is Ignatius's invitation to us across the centuries, an invitation to find God not just in the grand and dramatic, but in the quiet moments where eternity touches time, where the divine whisper meets our listening heart. And so I invite you to take just a moment right now, wherever you are, to enter into a brief silence. Close your eyes if that's comfortable for you. Take a slow, deep breath, and simply become aware of God's loving presence with you, closer to you than your own breath. Allow yourself to rest in this presence, even if just for a few seconds. This is the beginning of the journey Ignatius invites us to, a journey into the heart of God, a journey that begins in silence but leads to a life of greater meaning, greater purpose, greater love. A life where we find God speaking to us not just in designated prayer times, but in all things, all moments, all experiences. A life where the boundary between sacred and secular dissolves in the recognition that all ground is holy ground when approached with an attentive heart. A life where we become not just hearers of God's word, but living embodiments of it. Channels of divine love and healing in a world desperately in need of both. This is the transformation that silence makes possible. The gift that awaits us when we finally stop long enough to listen, truly listen, for the voice that has been calling us from the beginning. The voice that even now is speaking your name with infinite tenderness and inviting you into a deeper communion than you've yet known. Listen. Just listen. In the silence, God is speaking to you.